You're listening to dkitalk.com.
So again, just to summarise the numbers, Murphy got 5,000, that was half the 10,000. O'Gorgon got 3,333, that was a third of the 10,000. And Smith got a sixth of the 10,000, that was 1,667. And that's all at the number 2 level. Now, there's only 3,000 votes available to be transferred. Bellew still needs to hold on to
his 7,000.
7,000. So what we do is we just go in the proportion. So there's 2 ways to look at this. Murphy got half the votes, O'Gorgon got a third, and Smith got a sixth. Now we could look at it another way. A sixth is a half of a third. So that means for every vote Smith gets, O'Gorgon is going to get 2 votes. And Murphy got half the votes, and a sixth is a third of a half. So for every vote Smith gets, Murphy gets 3 votes. So we've counted the 10,000 votes, and Murphy got half them. So Murphy had 5,000. O'Gorgon got a third of them, 3,333, and Smith got a sixth of them, 1,667. Now, Bellew has 10,000 votes, but he needs to hold on to 7,000 of them. That means he has 3,000
surplus.
Spare. Yeah, 3,000 surplus, 3,000 spare. So, what we do is, we look at the number 3,000. How many of those 3,000 votes are going to go to Murphy? Because Murphy got half the number 2s, that means he's going to get half the 3,000. So Murphy's going to end up getting 1,500 votes. O'Gorgon got a third of the 10,000 number 2s, so he's ending up getting a third of the 3,000 votes.
He gets 1,000.
He gets 1,000. Smith got a sixth of the 10,000 votes, so in reality he's going to end up getting a sixth of the 3,000 votes.
Which is 500.
Which is 500.
So now we've had 500 for one, 1,000 for another, 1,500 for the other, which is the 3,000 surplus.
Which is 3,000 surplus. Correct.
Do you know what I find interesting about that, James? I had always simplistically assumed that what had happened is that when you got your 10,000, the 7,000 got your quota, and then there was 3,000 round around in a bundle. And I often wondered how you selected those. But that's actually what the meaning of proportional representation is.
Yes. Now we have to talk about the selecting. But just to recap on that again, Murphy earns half the surplus because he got half the number 2s. So the surplus was 3,000. So Murphy is going to get 1,500. O'Gorgon earned a third of the number 2s. So he's going to get a third of the surplus, which is 1,000. And Smith earned a sixth of the surplus. So he gets a sixth of the 3,000 votes, which is 500 votes.
Right.
Now, it comes to the stage where what papers get moved. So we come back and we look at Murphy's papers. Now, Murphy has 5,000 papers that say Bellew number 1, Murphy number 2. Now, Murphy's only going to get 1,500 of those.
Of those 5,000?
Of those 5,000.
Right.
And the other ones, the other 3,500 will have to stay with Bellew. They have to stay in that pile because he needs those votes for his quota.
1,500 of the 5,000
Correct.
are simply going to physically move to Murphy. The other 3,500 are going to stay with Bellew.
Bellew, exactly. Now we'll talk about the moving in a minute. The same with O'Gorgon. O'Gorgon has 3,333. We've already said he's going to get 1,000 of them. So we take 1,000 of those 3,333 papers and move them to O'Gorgon's piles. And the same with Smith. Smith's getting 500 of the 1,667, and those 500 are moved to Smith's piles. So the remaining question is, come back to Murphy. Those papers say 1 Bellew, 2 Murphy. There's 5,000 of them. How do we move the 1,500 to Murphy?
How do we select them?
And we select them. So there's actually a physical selection done. Now remember we said that the piles were counted in bundles of 50. So the counters, it's supposed to reflect a kind of a random thing. What the counters do, what they decide is, we need to take 1 paper from the top of each pile and move them over to Murphy. Or they might decide we might need to take 2 papers from each pile, or whatever the appropriate number is. So they actually just physically take a paper from the top of each pile of 50, or 2 papers or whatever, and they just physically move them until they have the 1,500 votes for Murphy. And those papers are then moved beside Murphy's bundles of papers. And they're now Murphy's votes. And the same for the other two candidates.
Right.
Now, there's like a randomness in that. It's okay for Murphy. He's getting the value of the vote. The vote said 1 Bellew, 2 Murphy. So Murphy is fine. Now, the next question you have to ask in the PR situation is, let's say Murphy is going to be eliminated down the line.
I mean, I can see this now.
Yes.
What happens to what happens to selection of the number 3 after
Correct.
Murphy? What
Correct.
happens to those?
Well, we'll come down there in a few minutes. But just to raise the question at this stage, the question is, we've left some papers behind and we've moved others.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the question is, did the papers we move, were the number 3s different than those in a relative sense to the ones we left behind? The randomness is, the reason they picked the 1 from each bundle or the 2 from each bundle is that it reflects the general trend of all Murphy's 5,000 votes. But we can't be guaranteed of that.
Right.
So that's a slight flaw in the PR system for later down the line.
Brings me back to why we got into this conversation a couple of months ago, because that was my question about computerising all these. Am I right in saying that if I went into a booth and pressed 1, 2, 3, 4 in a computer, that the weightings applied to all of those by the computer would take into account all of that? There would be no randomness.
There would be no randomness. Yeah. And that sort of leads on, we won't go into the detail of it now, but in the north of Ireland, the way they operate PR, there wouldn't be that sort of apparent sort of unfairness in the system. Well, it's a minute thing. The papers have been written about this, and the conclusion is that the PR system is generally fair, but in very tight constituencies, let's say you have a 5-seat constituency, and if it comes down to the last 2 candidates differing by 1 vote in the end, this process could dictate one way or the other.
Yeah, can I say, because if in a recount, a total recount, we come back to the same watershed where a person got elected, Bellew, had 10,000 votes, and now the 3,000 to spare.
Yes.
Because the number 2s were counted, we get the very same proportionalities.
Yes.
Where Murphy got half of the number 2s from Bellew.
Correct.
But this time, the actual movement of papers, because of the randomness, by definition, could be different.
I don't think, maybe I'm wrong about this, in a recount situation, I don't think they rejig, they check the counting of the votes, but I don't think they kind of mix all the votes back up again and pick a different...
Because if you did, you get a different result.
You could get a different result down the line.
Right.
Yeah. Well, maybe just to finish this here, there's one assumption we made just for the first example, and the one assumption was that all the votes are transferable. Bellew had 10,000 votes, and we sort of assumed that the 10,000 votes were transferable. But what we'll do is we'll pick a second example where some of the votes aren't transferable, and that will reflect what happens in reality a bit more closely. And it'll also serve as another example just for the listener to kind of get into the PR. And we won't be changing the numbers very much. Right. So maybe if we go through the second example.
And I mean, yet, once again, if at the outset of the programme I mentioned the fact that if you want to follow this and play along with it, you might want to get a pencil and a piece of paper and write it out. You'll see now why we said it at the start, because only when you see the paper, the figures in front of you, it's a bit like doing crosswords, you can enjoy it. Yeah. But also the great thing about this medium is play it again, and if there's a bit you don't understand, listen to it again until you get it.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. So we'll pick same constituency, and we keep the numbers similar. Again, the quota is 7,000. Bellew got his 10,000 votes, so the surplus was 3,000. So no change there. Now, the next stage in the process is Bellew has now been elected, so he has 3,000 votes to pass on to the next candidates. So we just repeat the process that we did in the last example. Bellew's 10,000 votes are going to be, we look at the number 2s in Bellew's 10,000 votes. And this time we just change the numbers a wee bit, just to factor in that some of those votes weren't transferable. So this time, Murphy ends up with 4,500 votes. O'Gogan ends up with 3,000 votes, number 2s. Smith ends up with 1,500 votes, and 1,000 are non-transferable.
So just to recap here,
recap those
of
numbers.
The 10,000 that Bellew had,
Yes.
When we're now looking at their number twos, we found that there was only 9,000 of those were validly able to be moved on.
Correct.
1,000 of those are dead.
That's right.
And we're now in a new proportion of the figures you give us now, which is
Correct.
4,500 for...
Well, we're in the same proportion, which is the good news.
All right.
9,000 papers are transferable.
It's still in play.
Are still at play. So we play the same ratios again. Murphy gets half of those.
Right.
Number twos. So there's 9,000 transferable. So Murphy gets 4,500. O'Gogan gets a third of them, so he gets 3,000. And Smith gets a sixth of them, which is 1,500. 1,500.
Right.
And again, we're looking at, these are all number twos. To say Bellew 1 and Murphy 2, O'Gogan 2, or Smith 2. So there's 3,000 votes of a surplus. So again, just like the last example, because Murphy got half the transferable number twos, he's going to get half the 3,000. So he's going to get 1,500. O'Gogan got a third of the transferable votes, so he's going to get a third of the 3,000 surplus. So O'Gogan is going to get 1,000. Smith got a sixth of the transferable votes, so Smith gets a sixth of the 3,000 surplus.
Right.
So he ends up getting 500 votes. And the actual interesting thing is that result is identical to the previous example. The candidates get exactly the same number of papers than in the last example where there was no transferable papers. So in an extent, it doesn't matter whether there's some papers that are non-transferable. The second candidates will get equal sort of...
In proportion to how the public wanted it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. So at the end of the second count, Bellew had 10,000 votes originally. He's holding on to 7,000 and 3,000 are transferred. Murphy gets half of those, which is 1,500. O'Gogan gets a third, which is 1,000. Smith gets a sixth, which is 500. And they're added on to their previous totals. Now, for simplicity, we didn't actually give you their earlier totals, but it doesn't really matter. We could maybe give you the totals later on and add them on, but it's just to explain the process. So that more or less ends the second count.
Right.
Now, just for the purists, if there's any what they call anoraks out there listening to us.
Is there anybody still with us?
Is there anybody still with us? Or, you know what an anorak is? A political anorak. The actual mathematical process, what they do at the count centre, they get the surplus, and the surplus is 3,000. And how many transferable papers are there? There were 9,000 transferable papers. So what we do is we come up with a fraction. We divide the surplus by the transferable papers. So in this simple example here, it was 3,000 divided by 9,000, which gives us a third. So we just hold on to that ratio of a third. Now, what they actually do in the count centre is they actually go through the 10,000 Bellew papers, and we saw that Murphy got 4,500 of those. So all you do is, how many papers will Murphy actually end up with? You get a ratio of a third, and you multiply by the 4,500, and you come up with your 1,500 papers.
So basically you take 1 in 3
Correct.
of the 4,500 bundle of papers that have twos on them for Murphy.
Yes.
And you give them to the Murphy
Exactly.
bundle, and the rest of them you put back in the Bellew lot.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
So it's just explaining in a more mathematical way how the process works, but it's the same end result. So that more or less ends the second count.
So now we've brought ourselves to this point where we've had a person elected, Bellew elected. We have gone through how that his surplus will now be divided proportionally to the other candidates.
And that's the end of the second count.
Right.
So we've achieved those results. And the candidate Murphy got 1,500, O'Gogan got 1,000, and Smith got 500. Now the next stage, several scenarios could happen. But just to demonstrate the complicated nature of PR, we'll assume that Murphy is now elected as a result of getting those 1,500 votes. So Murphy has now got a surplus. So the next stage is to distribute Murphy's surplus. So we'll try and tease out what happens at that stage. So we'll tease out what happens Murphy's 1,500 votes at the next count.
You've been listening to dkitalk.com.